Good afternoon. I'm Amanda McGill Johnson, Executive Director of Nebraska Cures. Nebraska Women in STEM is a partnership of Nebraska Cures and Bio Nebraska. At Nebraska Women in STEM, it's our mission to reduce barriers for women in STEM and create environments for women to thrive. Part of that mission is bringing you webinars today that really elevate amazing women in STEM out there doing really cool work. Make sure you regularly check our website, nebraskawomenInSTEM.com, for upcoming events like this. Our next big one is our Celebrating Women in STEM luncheon on October 29th, where we've revamped our awards for women in STEM. So right now we're in the process of vetting the nominees, and we'll have announcements on who the winners of those awards will be, and we'll celebrate them at the luncheon. That's coming up very soon. So with all that behind us, now it's time to meet Dr. Picci. A quick FYI, as she's presenting about her work, if you have any questions, just drop them in the chat and we'll get to them when she's done with her part of the presentation, and then we'll shift to a little bit of a Q&A with her just about being a woman in STEM. So our conversation with Dr. Giorgia Picci. Dr. Picci is a developmental neuroscientist and the Susan and George Haddix Chair of Developmental Neuroscience at the Institute for Human Neuroscience at Boys Town National Research Hospital. The work she's going to talk about today focuses on how hormonal changes across the lifespan shape the brain and mental health. So welcome, Giorgia.
Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and share screen and get us set up here. Okay.
All right, it just popped up.
How's that?
Looks good.
Okay, great. All right. Well, thank you so much, Amanda, for the invitation. It's honestly, it's exciting to get to share some of the work that we've been doing in the lab. And this is definitely a newer venture for us. As you mentioned, I'm a developmental neuroscientist, and I've kind of buried the lead in this presentation about how this all connects, but I will get there. So this area of work really marries a lot of my passions, including women's health. So to get us started, a lot of what I'm going to talk about is the menstrual cycle today. And really what I first wanted to point out is that increasingly so, the menstrual cycle is recognized as a vital sign. So much like blood pressure, heart rate, those sorts of things, body temp, the menstrual cycle is also viewed as a vital sign because there's a lot of information that we can learn about physical health just from the menstrual cycle, including things like length, flow, pain experienced, and other symptom sets. And issues with the menstrual cycle can be an indicator of other underlying health issues that women may be experiencing. And really being able to characterize hormonal dynamics that are happening in women, and not just in women, also men too. We're not talking about men today, but it's true for them. You know, it's not just an issue of fertility, it's also an issue of health. And studies that have looked at sex hormones and hormones typically associated with the menstrual cycle have shown us that they regulate so many functions outside of the reproductive system. So we've learned important things about migraines, epilepsy, mood disorders like anxiety and depression, dementia even. So like women are more at risk for Alzheimer's, and increasingly so, there are sex hormone aspects of that that are being identified. So one take home from today is that, you know, hormones are not just important for reproduction, they're important for general health. And then just kind of a very brief biology lesson about the menstrual cycle, because I feel like even though half the population experiences it, you know, we don't give it a ton of thought about what's happening, but I think it's worth talking about because it is kind of insane, the amount of dynamic range that's happening in our hormones every month. So so the cycle, day one of your cycle is when menstruation happens. So that's when your uterine line is being shed. That's part of the follicular stage. And so during the follicular stage, there's a hormone called FSH, so follicle stimulating hormone, that stimulates the growth of ovarian follicles that nourish and protect the egg. And then as estrogen starts to rise, it triggers release of luteinizing hormone, LH. And when that peaks, that coincides with ovulation. So the follicle ruptures and the egg is released. And then right after that, during the luteal stage, progesterone rises rapidly to prepare the uterus for implantation of the egg or pregnancy. And so this whole process is extremely dynamic and it's very metabolically taxing, even though we're going through this day to day. And the amount that your hormones, women's hormones, are changing throughout the month is pretty dramatic. It varies a lot by person, but for some individuals, those fluctuations are very dramatic. So the other important thing to note, since I identify as a neuroscientist, the other thing that I think is worth pointing out is that the brain is really responsible for regulating the menstrual cycle. And there are a lot of bidirectional feedback loops that are happening to be able to enable menstruation to happen. And that happens through communication between the brain and ovaries. So it's really a cross-system process. So it starts with the hypothalamus that triggers release of gonadotropin releasing hormone that then communicates with the pituitary that sits kind of at the base of the brain. And that releases LH, FSH, and that is what kind of promotes the release of estrogen and progesterone. And as I've illustrated here, there's a lot of feedback loops at multiple levels of that cascade. And the other really important thing I think is worth noting is that estrogen and progesterone receptors are distributed all over the brain. So to give you an example here, this is just from studies of estrogen specifically, but the same is true for progesterone, where as an example, in the prefrontal cortex, there are a lot of estrogen receptors. So one of the things that we can kind of glean from that and from studies that look at brain and behavior is that estrogen is really important for regulating cognition and behavior and emotions. So it's not just about, the cascading effects that have to do with reproduction. And until very recently, this hasn't really been an area of study, especially in humans, for a number of reasons that I'll go over in a moment. But we're just starting to scratch the surface of what these hormones are actually doing in the brain. But we are starting to understand that like the day-to-day fluctuations that happen in estrogen and progesterone in women do have strong influences on mood, behavior, and cognition. So why are we only just now starting to ask these questions? Well, one of the main reasons is because there's a really big health gap in understanding women's brain health, especially. And one of the reasons for this, and it's kind of an open secret, I guess, is that neuroscientists have systematically neglected women's health because, as an example, in animal studies, one of the justifications researchers will use for excluding female rats, as an example, is because of the menstrual cycle or estrus. Because they say, oh, the hormonal fluctuations are so noisy, like this is going to perturb our data. So they look at it as a nuisance. And so that's been used for many, many years as a justification for excluding women or female animals, I should say. So for that reason and for a number of other reasons, women's health has not been prioritized. And so a lot of basic research, like an effect of this is that a lot of basic research, including medical research, has been gleaned from men. And that has led to, frankly, a lot of issues with our understanding of how different disease states unfold in women. People like to talk about heart attacks as an example, like the classic symptoms that were originally associated with heart attack were based on men, and women actually experienced different symptoms. And so we didn't know that because most of the work was based on men. So this has a lot of repercussions for women, for half the population. So the unfortunate thing too with neuroscience, especially human brain studies, so neuroimaging, fMRI came to the fore in the 1990s. That's when we started to really use it to understand the human mind and the brain. And there's a good study that's looked at how many studies actually consider women's health factors, and it's 0.5%, so not even a full percent, has expressly looked at factors that affect women's health. So this is absolutely a dire area of need that we need to understand. So there's really kind of we're at a frontier right now of neuroscientists really coming together and trying to understand motherhood, menstruation, menopause, because there are these periods of extreme hormonal flux that are experienced normatively, but we really don't understand what the repercussions of them are, what the normative processes are, and then by extension, we are really limited in understanding how these things affect disease states. To give you one very small example, the women's brains during pregnancy were not mapped until 2024. So the first, actual like longitudinal study of a pregnant woman, repeatedly scanned to look at, how her hormones and changes in the brain are occurring during pregnancy and after pregnancy. That was in 2024. So this is just to put that into perspective.
That is shocking. I have to interrupt you. Like,
Yeah, it's
no
really
clue. That
shocking.
is
And
so shocking.
yeah, it's shocking, it's disappointing, but we have a major opportunity. And I hope, that a lot of people will be inspired to like enter the field because we have so much to learn. Um, so as I mentioned before, hormones fluctuate on a daily basis, not just for women, for men too. And it varies a lot by individual, and also not just in terms of the levels, but how sensitive people are to those hormones. And so, one of the things that the field has started to do is, in order to characterize such a dynamic process, we've had to move towards more individualized ways of studying the menstrual cycle. So, what I mean by that is, historically, the push has been to examine large samples. So like lots of different people to try to look at kind of averages over groups to see how these things unfold. The problem with that is that it's really hard to get a lot of people to look at a very dynamic process that requires many, many samples from an individual, since it is such an individualized process. So now what we do is something that's called dense sampling, where we don't go out and get a lot of participants, we just get a few participants, but we characterize them really, really well, including getting daily assessments. So in our lab, just as an example, one study we did, we had a couple of women come in daily for a month, and we did intake to ask about, their sleep the night before, information about kind of what they did, then brain scans every day in the morning, saliva, blood to get their hormone levels, and then lots and lots of questionnaires about what happened throughout the day in terms of their mood, cognition, different symptoms related to the menstrual cycle, to try to characterize within individuals what is happening, with their hormone levels and their brain. And this study is affectionately called SMORES, which is sampling menstrual oscillatory rhythms and endocrine systems. So this is like in direct contrast to existing methods, but is becoming increasingly popular because it really has helped us to understand what is happening at an individual level. So this is just to give you an example of one participant. So she came in 28 days in a row and did all of these assessments every day to try to capture those hormone-linked brain changes. And on the right, you can see kind of how her cycle unfolded. And this is a very typical cycle with the peak in estradiol around ovulation, and then the increase in progesterone that's happening during the luteal phase. And one of the initial things that we found is that there are clear links between mood throughout the month and hormones. So first of all, like looking at menses, so in the dotted line in blue, that's negative mood, essentially. So every single day she reported on her negative mood. And when estrogen is low, negative mood is high. And so that is consistent with animal work and human work, suggesting that estrogen can be protective in a number of ways, including against mood problems. So that was one initial finding. And then in terms of brain changes across the menstrual cycle, other groups have shown that through repeated scans of individual women that there are rapid structural changes that happen in the hippocampus, as an example, that relate to progesterone levels. So there's actually like changes in the size of that area of the brain. And that area of the brain is really important for learning and memory and cognition. Other things that are really interesting that have been uncovered is that the day-to-day fluctuations that happen in estradiol influence how efficient brain networks are. So as an example here, this is pointing out the default mode network, which is a network of different brain regions that work together to process aspects of self-reflection, how we think about other people. So really high order cognition processes that we know are fluctuating with estradiol, which is not surprising because there are a lot of receptors for estrogen in these areas of the brain. So these are some of the initial findings from this area of work that are really exciting, but also highlight we have a lot of work to do in terms of mapping out what's happening. So for me, as a developmental neuroscientist, the thing I'm really interested in actually is puberty, and that's what my lab predominantly focuses on. So I'm hoping next steps for us is to really try to understand menarche. So that's when girls first start getting their periods, and that happens during puberty. It's one of the major milestones. And the thing about puberty is that there is, 20-fold to 30-fold increases in sex hormones during puberty. And puberty is really thought of as kind of the trigger point for major kind of reorganization of the brain and behavior to learn to accomplish, adult levels of independence. It's a period of rapid learning. However, it also is a double-edged sword because adolescence is really the peak period when we see the onset of most major mental health disorders. 50% of mental health disorders are diagnosed during adolescence. Before the age of 14 or 15. By age 25, 75% have been diagnosed. So this is a period of opportunity, but it's also a period of vulnerability. And menarche is known to coincide with increased risk for internalizing symptoms, so things like anxiety and depression in girls. So this is an area that we really want to understand, because if we can understand how these things begin during adolescence, we can better understand how to prevent and intervene during a time when the brain is super plastic, and hopefully we can redirect trajectories. And then I just wanted to leave you with, I talked about the menstrual cycle, but really, this is about the entire lifespan. And so, we have a huge opportunity here to understand women's health. And it's not just about women, it's about the people in their life. And it's about the systems that they are in, including healthcare systems. So basically across the entire lifespan, this doesn't include infancy, but infancy is also a period where initially there's heightened hormone activation. And so puberty, menstrual cycles, pregnancy is a huge time of major hormonal fluctuations. And then of course, menopause, which is so poorly understood, especially in humans. So each of these transitions is something that is low-hanging fruit. We really need to understand, and I think will be to the betterment of healthcare and understanding health and disease. So thank you to my lab, the Candy Lab, and our funders. And thank you again for having me today. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Just fascinating work that you're doing. Please, folks, feel free to raise your hand or unmute, or just type a question in the chat if you'd like. while they're waiting. So what is like the next thing you're going to do along these lines?
Yeah, so we're continuing to recruit and try to collect data with, across the menstrual cycle. And then the long-term goal would be to be able to design a study where we can get adolescents to come in repeatedly, probably not every day, because that's just not realistic, but even to get them to come in once a week to try to start to understand, what's happening with their neurodevelopment and hormonal fluctuations and their mental health, because that's one of our primary focuses.
Okay.
um, that would probably be the hopefully the next step.
Okay. So if there are people who are interested in being a part of this, can they reach out to you afterwards?
Totally.
Is that okay? We'll
Yeah.
make sure to do a post email on
Yeah.
this and send out Dr. Peachy's information. Ivy, I see your hand is up.
Hi,
Hi.
my name is Ivy. Currently, and I like as someone who has like struggled with like women's health issues in the past. My question to you is like, how would this impact like research on things like PMOS and endometriosis and like fibroids and other like kind of hard to diagnose conditions such as those?
Yeah, so that's really important. And I didn't mention that, but there's definitely that is a growing area of research. So, people experiencing PCOS, endometriosis, they have irregular menstrual cycles. And that likely has a lot of repercussions for mental health. And so that definitely is an area of inquiry that I think is very active and but still a lot to learn.
Here's a question in the chat with how difficult is it to establish? Are there any plans to focus on perimenopause and how to better diagnose that?
Yeah, I would say so. Some of the work that I've done in collaboration with people has been on aging populations and trying to understand like the window of perimenopause and brain changes that are happening. Me specifically, I'm, a developmental neuroscientist, so I'm really focused on earlier. But if you take a broader lens on development, that still is a period of change. And so I think it's very interesting, but not something that my lab is focused on. But absolutely, there's a whole community of researchers focused on perimenopause and the transition and brain changes that are happening.
One more question, and maybe this is you haven't quite got to this point in your research yet, but talking about approaching schools for data gathering, like could there be a way to collect data? But you're using like MRIs and stuff, right? And so that may be
Yeah,
difficult to.
yeah, yeah, it's tough to get into the schools. It's an interesting idea. And I think there has to be like some reciprocity, like maybe through an educational program, we could do aspects of this research. But yeah, for the most part, it requires that people come into the lab, unfortunately.
It's big technology that you're using. Yeah, the chat's filling up with some more questions. In your research, have you touched on PMDD at all? From what I've read, it has to do with increased sensitivity to hormones, but I would be interested to know your thoughts on it.
Yeah, we do not focus on that because we've been really focused on normative cycles. But there is an entire literature on PMDD. And there's also this idea that even outside of PMDD, there's just women who are hormone sensitive. And there are a lot of different factors that contribute to that, including early life experiences. So, like experiencing more trauma is linked to hormone sensitivity. And that makes sense to me personally because we know that early life stress affects the HPA axis, which is tied to puberty and hormone regulation, and it interacts with the other axes that regulate the menstrual cycle. So I think all of these things are related. And like I said, yeah, very active areas of inquiry, but yeah, not something that we're focused on at this very moment, but it is important and interesting.
Well, and hopefully, like you said, this is kind of a new budding area of research. And so
Mhm.
hopefully there'll be more interest and maybe even funding to different researchers across the world, really,
Yeah,
to dig into all the nuances of different issues.
absolutely.
Um, you can keep adding your questions to the chat. I'm going to pivot to some of just the broader questions that we typically ask of the women who come and visit us for this profile series. And the first one being, what has helped you become a successful woman in STEM? Maybe it's some people, maybe it's an institution or programming, but what has helped you be successful?
I would say probably number one thing is mentorship. So, along the way, it's sort of a long road, towards being an independent scientist. And I've had a number of really, really good mentors that have supported me along the way, both in graduate school and in my postdoc, and even currently, just people who have encouraged me to pursue these sorts of ideas. Like this is a little bit outside of my original training, so it's always a risk to do things like that. But having people that believe in you and encourage you, and put you in touch with resources and networks, like it's totally invaluable to helping with the trajectory.
Yes. We did get another question in the chat, so I want to mind those. Just asking if you've included women on birth control in your study, or like, are you looking for that or not looking for that?
We have not, but we're interested in it. And that is something that other people are looking at, because essentially a lot of the dynamics that I showed, those are suppressed when women are on birth control. So there's also really interesting things to learn from that as well, especially because a lot of teenagers are on birth control. And I don't think we really fully know what that is doing to the developing brain. And so that's something that we really need to be paying attention to.
That is really never even crossed my mind.
Yeah.
Okay, so going back to you and maybe your trajectory, have there been barriers you've had to overcome? Women have had very different experiences, I feel like, in that space, or anything of note that you'd like to share.
Yeah. I feel like most people, especially women in science, tend to have nonlinear trajectories. So
Mm.
I am one of those people, definitely a nonlinear trajectory. A lot of points where I was really unsure of whether I could do this.
Mhm.
And that gets back to like mentorship and having people that support you and can help you along the way. I think particular challenges, you know, during grad school, I had a family member that had like pretty significant health issues while I was doing my dissertation. And so that was extremely challenging. But I think it's a lesson in, life happens, whether or not you're in school or whatever you're trying to pursue, it just happens. And I think, building up those social support systems is so important, because when things like that happen, you need to be able to have your people that can support you. And I think it taught me a lot about, what is important, what's not important, and prioritizing those things, and knowing that, a lot of us are capable of a lot more than we think we are. And it's really not until you're faced with those challenges that you can, see that in yourself. But yeah, definitely a lot of growth in that period for me.
Yeah. And this next question is kind of related to that, but like, what pieces of advice, do you have for other women in STEM earlier in their careers, or maybe even in the same place? I don't know. Any
Yeah.
thoughts come to mind?
Um, I think so. In the same vein of, having a non-linear trajectory, I think staying open and agile along the way is really healthy. I think I had cohort mates that were like, I'm going to do this, I'm going to be this, this is my endpoint. And I think that works out for some people. But I think oftentimes it's not exactly, it sets you up for potentially disappointment, because sometimes things just don't work out the way you think they're going to. And so just understanding that everything you're doing is just a lot of different little decision points. And so the more that you can stay open, you can recognize these different decision points as like potential opportunities. and just know that, I think if you believe things are going to like come together and work out and you're like working towards a longer term goal, I think things tend to work out. That's sort of my perspective. And then, of course, mentorship and collaboration is essential. And then I think like as I've kind of gotten more independent, really trying to understand and identify your values. It sounds kind of hokey, but it's really helped me a lot, like what actually matters to me and what are the things that guide my decision making. Because the sooner you can understand that, the more you understand yourself and how you react to things. And it can really help you, figure out your path.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Like, and values can differ from person to person, just like their brains and their
Yeah,
menstrual cycles, and the impact is
totally.
different.
Yeah.
And someone may really love taking risks, and someone likes more
Yeah.
stability. And what does that mean for your
Yeah,
career choices, right?
totally.
Are there any other questions from folks? One question I do like to always have near the end is I love hearing about what brings joy to people. What is it about your job or life that makes you feel fulfilled?
Yeah, I think in my job, the number one thing is being able to be a mentor to people. It's really special to have someone join the lab and they don't really have a lot of experience, and you just watch them become a scientist and develop their own interests, and just being able to play like a small role in someone's trajectory is just like so special. It's one of my favorite things. I think I get more excited when mentees like have their successes than when I have my own, because it's just, yeah, it's so exciting. And then in my life, I think, yeah, my family is like number one. Yeah, my husband and my dog and our cats are
Oh.
source of joy in my life. So yeah.
Oh, beautiful. Well, unless there are any other questions, you can raise your hand real quick or not. But otherwise, I will be sending out a post email with how to reach Dr. Picci for anyone who might be interested in additional information or maybe even participating in that program.
Yep.
Otherwise, any final thoughts on your end?
No, just really appreciative of the work that Nebraska Cures is doing. And yeah, just thank you so much for the invitation.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you. Have a great day, everyone. Take care.